Hello. Well, I'd like to welcome you all to this special webinar to try and think a little bit about a very recent and very interesting news development that we've had here at Magdalene with the identification of a wonderful collection of books which belong to a person called Mary Astell. We're going to talk a little bit about Mary Astell herself, a little bit about the book collection, and also about the way in which the collection was found. But we're going to begin with a kind of round table discussion. So I'd like to introduce you to the people who are going to begin the discussion, but we do hope that everybody will join in with questions towards the end. So Teresa Bejan is here, who is the Associate Professor of Political Theory and a Fellow of Oriel College in Oxford. She wrote a couple of years ago a very important book which has been very well reviewed and very influential in the field, called Mere Civility, Disagreement and the Limits of Toleration. And you might also know her because she blogs regularly and she often appears in podcasts and on the radio. I'm sure heard her on BBC Radio 4 and other radio podcasts. So it's a great pleasure that Teresa is joining us. We also have Professor James Raven. James is a Professor of Modern History at the University of Essex and also a Senior Research Fellow here at Magdalene. He's the author of numerous books, most recently the Bookscape Geographies of Printing and Publishing in London, which were the Panzini lectures, which he gave and have now been published, but also Publishing Business in 18th Century England, and Lost Mansions, Essays on the Destruction of the Country House, which for those of us who have country houses is a bit of a worry, but he's the president of the Bibliographical Society as well. So it's lovely for James to be joining us. Thank you very much indeed. And also the person who actually made the discovery that we're talking about today, who is the Deputy Librarian in the Pepys Library and the Old Library here at Magdalene, Catherine Sutherland. She has special responsibilities for the special collections and the historic libraries. She has published on the relationship between Samuel Pepys and Evelyn, and she regularly blogs here on our college blog on different aspects of the historic libraries. And so it's great that she's able to join us today and tell us a little bit about how this wonderful and remarkable identification took place. So just to say a little bit about the topic of this roundtable discussion, we have a number of libraries, as you know. I know many of the people here are already familiar with the college. The Pepys Library, very famous, the College Library, our magnificent new College Library, which has literally just, the mortar is still wet between the bricks. But also the Old Library, and this may not be quite so familiar, even to those people who perhaps were here in the college as undergraduates or indeed here now as students or here as fellows. I remember when I first came to Magdalene, a very senior fellow said to me, "Isn't the Old Library that cupboard opposite the chapel?" And anyway, it turns out the Old Library is not a cupboard opposite the chapel. The Old Library is this really remarkable collection of books. And one of the things we've been trying to do over the last few years is to find out exactly what we've got, think about the provenance of it, think about how it could be useful to scholars, both within the college, but also people who are interested outside the college as well. And in some ways, if it were not for the Pepys, our Old Library would be a really kind of very famous library. But somehow it's always been rather overshadowed by this very famous library that we have. So what we're going to be talking about is a recent identification of a group of books which were all apparently owned by one particular person. There's a lot of intrigue about how we ended up with them, how they came to the college. We're going to talk about that. But I thought before we talk about the actual books, I'm going to turn to Teresa and ask her to tell us a little bit about the person who we think originally owned this collection of books. It's a woman called Mary Astell. So I don't know if, Teresa, if you could just fill us in a little bit about Mary, and then sort of carry on from there.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'll just start by saying thank you so much for having me and allowing me as an Oxford person to interlope in this Cambridge affair. But I'm here in my capacity as an Astle scholar and just as someone who's so excited about Catherine's discovery and just can't wait to get into the Magdalene Library myself to get my hands on some of these books. But I'll just tell you a bit about Mary Astell's life and also about her thought. She was born in 1666 in Newcastle to a sort of downwardly mobile gentry family. Her father was a coal merchant, and her uncle was a local curate, and he had been educated at Cambridge. And the theory goes among Astle scholars that although Mary as a female child would not have received a formal education, she likely received an informal education at home, and especially from her uncle. And the grounds for thinking this have to do with her evident familiarity and then later mastery of Christian Platonist ideas. And of course, Ralph Astle would have been educated at Cambridge at a time when so-called Cambridge Platonism was at a high tide. Mary herself, she was sadly, she lost her father at the age of 12. The family fell on hard times, and as a gentle woman without a dowry, it sort of soon became pretty clear that the sort of expectation that she would need to make a marriage suitable to her station wasn't going to come through. And then she does the absolutely extraordinary thing, which I think is the first of many extraordinary things that she's going to do in her life. She picks up and moves as a single woman to London at the age of about 20 or 21 and settles in Chelsea, where she'll remain for the rest of her life. There was no indication, though, initially that what she would do when she got to London was right. There were women writers, but the idea that a woman might make her living by her pen was really unthinkable. And certainly it's the case that although Astle's writings would subsequently sell very well, she was not making money off of her writing. It seems that mostly she later in life would be supported by her collection of, well, maybe collection is the wrong way of putting it, but a very close circle of aristocratic female friends who supported Astle, especially in her older age, and clearly loved her very much. And I think Catherine can tell us a bit about those friends being the source of some of the books that have been found at Magdalene. But so think of young Mary moving to London at the time of the so-called Glorious Revolution, although she herself would not have thought it so glorious. In her politics, she remained all her life a high church Anglican Tory who really disapproved of all revolutions and was very personally attached to the Stuarts. But in any case, Mary is known to us today primarily as the author of a series of what we would call today feminist texts. So her first publication is in 1694, and it's called A Serious Proposal to the Ladies. And it's a defense of women's education, and more particularly a proposal for the establishment of a female academy. Later, she would write in 1700 something that went through multiple editions, Some Reflections Upon Marriage, which was a critique of the institution of patriarchal marriage as it existed in her own day. And perhaps her most famous line came from her 1706 preface to the third edition of Some Reflections on Marriage. She says, "How is it that all men are born free and all women are born slaves?" Right? So that gives you a sense of Mary Astell as ringing down the centuries as a kind of early feminist in the 1690s and early 1700s. Although we know her mainly today as a feminist, though, it's important really to emphasize, and something that's going to be emphasized, I think, across this event, that Astle wrote in a number of genres which were quite unusual for women to write in, not only philosophy and theology, but also politics. And in 1704, she releases a series of political pamphlets engaging in the occasional conformity controversy about people, mostly Whigs, trying to hold public office by occasionally conforming to the Church of England, which of course, as a high church Tory, rubbed Mary Astell the wrong way. And in 1705, she published her magnum opus, The Christian Religion as Professed by a Daughter of the Church of England. So again, we want to keep in mind the wide range of Astell's writings, not just simply focus on her writings most explicitly on women's issues. It's worth saying, though, that at the end of her life, she died in 1731, sadly, of breast cancer. But for the last few decades before she died, she pretty much put down her pen. She reissued some of her pamphlets, but she had turned her attention to running a charity school for girls in Chelsea. And it's this turn from intervening in the public sphere in print to great reputation, but also notoriety, to a more private life of educating women herself and dedicating herself in a very sort of ascetic and sort of pious life of improving women's lives in the way that she could personally. That really is I think the quite poignant end to her life. Before I turn over, I would just say, I'm really excited as an Astle scholar myself to be working on her thought in a time when we're making these new discoveries, but also at a time where the sort of the focus of women's studies and feminist studies on Astle, we owe so much for reviving her, but also now trying to consider her as a woman thinker who thought more widely across a wide range of issues. And I can't wait to just dive into the collection and see what's there.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, Teresa. That's just a lovely introduction to someone we're going to be talking about really all the way through this evening. This figure who may not be particularly familiar to many people, but you've really gave us a sort of sense of how she might be interesting from lots of different kind of points of view, and not only being a woman, but also as a philosopher and educationalist and many other things. I just ought to remind people, if you want to ask any questions, you can use the Q&A facility at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Please do send your questions in, and we're not going to talk for the whole time ourselves. We're going to address some of the questions as well. So please do send any questions in that you might want to. So as we were saying, one of the sort of impetus behind this meeting today is this discovery of a particular collection of volumes which were owned by Mary Astell in one way or another. And I'd like to turn over to Catherine Sutherland to ask her to just explain a little bit about what is in this collection of books, and just to give us a kind of sense of what it is physically that we are sort of talking about in terms of a collection within the old library.
Yes, if I could ask my colleague Sarah to share an image of the collection. You should be able to see it on your screen in a moment. So the collection consists of almost 50 books. Oh, there they are with me. So Astle either bought these books herself, usually secondhand, I think, that were already bound, or she was given them as gifts. The books are closely aligned with topics that she was writing about herself, by authors that we know she was influenced by. So there's a lot of French philosophers in the collection, such as Nicolas Malebranche and René Descartes. So we know that Astle was led to read French philosophical works by her colleague, should I say, John Norris, who she corresponded with, and they published their correspondence. And he suggested to her that she should really read Malebranche, which is definitely what she's done, because there's a lot of his works in the collection. So the collection is a really neat fit with what we've already sort of established about the influences on her work. And the books she received as gifts tend to sit a sort of a little outside her principal fields of interest, but they still tell us interesting things about her circle of friends. So as Teresa alluded to, her circle of aristocratic female friends, we find that quite a few of the books were given by those friends to Astle. One of these is a copy of an Anglo-Saxon text which was translated by Elizabeth Elstop, who is another academically minded woman of the period. And Astle had helped to raise subscriptions for this work, but she was given a copy of the work by her friend Elizabeth Hastings, Lady Elizabeth Hastings. So yes, as I say, everything is a sort of neat fit for what books we would expect her to own, but there are still books in there which there was no evidence of her reading before, that she hadn't cited in her writings. So it's a very cohesive collection, but also there are some nice surprises in there as well.
Thank you. Thanks. Can we go back, Sarah, to the regular screen, please? It's lovely. Thank you very much. Thanks. Well, you got a lovely image there, actually, of the old library.
Yeah.
Not only the deputy librarian in the old library, but also the books owned by Mary Astell sort of lined up there, but also the books behind, which mostly are books owned by Peter Peckard, the master of Magdalene in the 18th century. I'd like to move on now to ask a question of James. Perhaps something that's occurred to people already. Is it unusual? Is it odd that a woman should have owned these books, and how might she have acquired them? You know, both sort of intellectually, and you know, how did she move in a circle in which she would be able to get hold of these things?
It's a very good question, Jane. And I suppose at first sight we might be a little surprised, because we would be used to the idea, and it's a well-founded idea historically, that in terms of general literacy levels, educational levels, and so on, it was more difficult for women to be in a society that was reading, to read themselves. But in fact, it shouldn't surprise us quite so much, because what we're talking about here is a very particular level of society, of course. And so an important issue to think about in terms of women and the access to books is not so much literacy, but different literacies, the ability to read not just in English perhaps, but also to have classical interests and to be able to read in other modern languages as well. And that's part of actually what in terms of the acquisition of books too, is really very, very interesting from where they're coming from, the languages that the books are in. And so, although we might be influenced by this idea of women's education, difficulty of access to education and so forth, lagging behind that of men, in fact, there are some very, very strong evidence of a lot of not just ownership, but also access to books by women, and so long as they are of a particular level of society, to be able to afford and to be able to move in the right connections and to have those connections of sort of sociability to enable them, as we've just been hearing, to share information about those books. I mean, the earliest book plate, interesting, we have that shows ownership goes back to 1608 by a woman called Margaret Pindar, and there's also a number of very interesting small collections of books by women, many of which have been researched and more are coming to light, actually. And there's an interesting, for those of you particularly interested in this, there's a new project which is called BOO, B-O-O, Book Ownership Online, which is hosted by the Bibliographical Society for books before 1715. And there are 67, well, there are 67 collections mentioning women, but there are 57 different collections there by women, but these are collections and libraries by women, rather like those of Mary Astell. And that therefore excludes those who are actually also having access to books as well by looking at books, the inscriptions of books and the like. In terms of acquiring them, this is also really interesting. We just heard from Catherine about the extent to which books might have been given to Mary. The donation of books, the leaving of books perhaps in people's wills, but also as gifts during their lifetime was important. And again, one has to think about the sort of area that we're, the boundary of what a collection is and access to that collection, because we might be thinking of a family library. For example, one of the most interesting early examples we have of an early woman reader and collector, Frances Wolferston. Her granddaughter, 2 generations later, was also an avid book collector and access, and the family there, the family library was really important, the extent to which books were handed down or people had access to it. And connections also through the men of the household in some respects as well, relationships to colleges and the universities or inns of court and the like of different sort of professional capacity as well, in the extent to which that access could be maintained through borrowing books and just actually having books as part of the collection. But one of the interesting things also, and in terms of the time we're talking about here, in terms of Mary Astell's life, in terms of acquiring books, is, and Catherine said, we think she might have bought some of them as well, is how you go about acquiring them. And during her lifetime, fixed site bookselling, actually the appearance of bookshops was more and more common. And in this respect, London was the absolute centre for this. And although, and we mustn't forget this, sometimes these networks of where women, actually where all the different libraries that we know about in the 17th century and early 18th century were really quite scattered, really quite all around the country. London was the pivotal centre. And a key aspect of that was, well, the network that came out of London through the early postal services from the middle of the 17th century, the establishment of general postal services, establishment actually of a post office in the 1640s in London. And so you could use postal services to connect with London booksellers and also receive information about books as well. And I'll just, if I can share my screen here, this might be of interest, because we know, and Catherine may say a little bit more about this in a moment, but we know that one particular bookshop was really interesting, that of Richard Wilkins. Let's see if I can share screen here. Oh, I'm having difficulty, sorry. Share, there we go. So, familiar site of London, roughly during Mary Astell's lifetime. And the key area here is all around St. Paul's Cathedral, with my marker is showing it. And in particular, there's a rather later view going up to St. Paul's Cathedral, of this area around St. Paul's Churchyard, the traditional area of bookselling, book sites. Everything in blue here is a site associated either with bookselling or printing or the book trades in general. And you can see really the majority of shops along Paternoster Row here, along the churchyard here, are those of booksellers. And we're particularly interested in Mr. Wilkins, and he was number 56 in the churchyard. Here's the churchyard, the famous Paul Cross churchyard, and 56 is around here. It's got about a 28-foot frontage. It's quite a big shop. Pepys, incidentally, and others often frequented the East End bookshops around here, but Mr. Wilkins was here. And you can see in this map showing 1720, this is 10 years before Mary Astell's death. Here is, again, the Wilkins shop, situated at the end of St. Paul's. And I think we can go through this. You can see it sort of changing in the 18th century. Those green sites are to do with book selling. And one of the most interesting aspects of this, just bringing up some, sorry about this, I'm trying to move this through, it's got a problem with it, is actually this, it's trying to just show the succession, there's a lot, there we are, the succession of bookshops. So in fact, if she was actually able to go to the bookshop itself, it would be known to be a site that was really traditionally associated with selling over quite a number of generations. Mr. Wilkins, from whom we knew she acquired many of the books at the Crane, has a whole heritage here of booksellers, succession of booksellers going right back to the 16th century. So if I end my screen there. So during her lifetime, there was more and more access to actual bookshops, possibly by herself, possibly by sending a servant, but also, finally, final point in that, actually as a venue where you could actually discuss new publications, discuss books perhaps that have been recommended by others, and importantly also acquiring older books and antiquarian books, but also crucially, and this is a really important aspect of the books that we've just seen, many were coming, the majority in fact, were printed abroad, coming from abroad. And so you've got to actually have a man or a woman, in some cases, really, of substance in the book trade who's actually able to handle the importation of books. And there again, this is the central importance of London and these particular key individuals with whom Mary would have had to have known, or to whom Mary's relations or friends would have to have known very well in order to acquire her books.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, that's really fascinating to see the map and to imagine, you know, exactly the location that some of these books came from. And as you're saying, sort of a place where there's a tradition that books were produced, and you know they've been sold there for 150 years as a sort of primary place where you could go to. But also, as you were saying, you know, that maybe she could send someone, you know, it wasn't necessarily that she went herself, but she could send someone, or perhaps people. I mean, what happened with Pepys is that very often the booksellers would come to him rather than the other way around, you know, that they'd know he wanted the latest Spanish, you know, thing that had just come out, and they'd send it, they'd have a runner, you know, saying, Mr. Pepys, here it is, you know. So it isn't always like a modern high street where you go into a retailer's. It's kind of a bit more like Amazon, really, where they come to you. So thank you anyway. But perhaps we could, Teresa, yes, do. Yeah, you need to unmute.
I think so. Catherine had raised a hand, and then I copied her and raised my hand. And so,
sorry,
yes,
Catherine.
Yes, I was just going to say a bit about Wilkin, in that there's a sort of common link there, because Astle was a client of Wilkin, as James said, but also Daniel Waterland, the master of Magdalene during the latter period of Astle's life, was also a client. So I like to imagine that they both met and conversed there, but that's just me imagining things. But so I do think Waterland played a role with the books coming to Magdalene, but that could be saved for later.
Yeah, I'm just going to add my 2 cents about Wilkin. Not only was Astle a client of Wilkin's, he was her publisher. So in her whole two-decade writing career, Wilkin was her publisher. I think they were introduced initially by Archbishop Sancroft, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, who obviously was forced out after the not so glorious revolution. But thinking about Wilkin as this kind of linchpin figure, and particularly at the center of a Tory literary community, I think is really important. Again, so seeing seeing Astle not sort of just as this, as the strange thing of a woman writer, which of course not so strange actually now that we appreciate more and more of the number of women writing, but particularly as a Tory polemicist in this Tory literary milieu.
If I could add, I mean, I think it's really fascinating about the site there, because although I take what was said about the comparison to Amazon, and Pepys was perhaps a bit lucky in having his runners come to him, actually, I think in most cases people would actually go to these sites. It's, we know too little in the 17th century, particularly, about how this really functions, snippets in diaries and the like. But I see no reason for Mary Astell not actually going in person there. And these were important sites for people to meet each other and discuss. And the booksellers actually opened, they had often, a bit later on perhaps, they had a sort of salon above the shop. They lived above the shop, of course. It was an inviting place, and you'd go there to meet people. And just briefly as well, these little shops around, particularly that row where Wilkin was, one of the really interesting things is the whole diversity of opinion, the diversity of those shops. So yes, that site, which was interesting, later became the very site of the Rivingtons, high Tory Anglicans in the 18th century. So these sites, side by side, very small, were often associated with very different political and religious positions. So it's quite an exciting, vibrant place to be, where you would actually be in the midst of a debate, of dialogue. So the idea of actually going to a site like that is really quite exciting.
Lovely, thank you. Can we turn over to Catherine? Because one of the questions that I'm sure is in everybody's mind is, there's this wonderful collection of books. Why didn't we know we had them? And so I wanted to sort of move over and ask Catherine just to say, how did it come about that we identified these books, and what was the sort of process behind that?
Yes, well, it really was the culmination of several years' work on a more general project, which was to form an online searchable list of what's in the old library, so that researchers can consult it. And this was done really in advance of more in-depth cataloguing of the books, which I'm undertaking at the moment. But I really wanted an overview of what was in the library. And because scholars are really interested in whether there's marginalia in the books, the provenance of the books, I wanted to make a note of that as I was going through systematically the books in the old library. So it was probably 5 years' work to go through all of the books. And what I then found was that we did have books that were owned by Mary Astell for definite, because she handily puts her full name in there, and who gave her the book in some cases, how much she paid for the book, etc. So once I saw that we have these few books owned by Astle, I could then go back and look at books that had a substantial amount of notes and marginalia in, which was anonymous and that she hadn't put her name to, but I could compare the handwriting and see, here's another Astle book. And they're quite distinctive compared to the other books in the library, because she was a copious annotator. she liked to put lots of marginalia in, lots of notes on the end papers, and sometimes she would compose indexes to go with the book. And also she wrote in a combination of pen, but also pencil as well. So that was quite unusual, I think. So as time went on, it became easier to identify, because the style was becoming more apparent as I was finding more examples. So if I could ask Sarah to share the screen of an example of an annotation of some notes that she's made in one of the books. So here we have, it's on the other side of this page is the title page. So it's the verso of the title page of a book by Nicholas Malebranche, who I've already mentioned, a French philosopher. And here Astle is writing notes on all the different editions of Malebranche, and she's clearly consulted multiple editions of his work. So she's really making an in-depth study. So that speaks to her thoroughness, but also speaks to the fact that she was able to acquire these books. So maybe she borrowed some as well. Yes, and also that she could read French as well, which has been discussed before, but the collection really confirms that she was adept at French. So in the research I've done, I've mainly concentrated on notes and inscriptions that relate to the bibliographical aspects, how she was collecting books, how she was reading the books, how she was making notes on the books. But there's also plenty of marginalia where she tackles the subject matter of the books as well. So there's plenty of room there for visiting researchers to come and consult these books and make their own discoveries.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Catherine. Should we go back, Sarah, to the screen, if you wouldn't mind? Thank you. Brilliant. Teresa, this obviously is a new range of material that we now have for Mary Astell studies, which, as you say, people, including yourself, have been really interested in her for a long time. But what would you say was the significance of this particular identification of these books as part of her collection?
Well, it's just huge. And again, I just want to celebrate Catherine and the work she put in on this. And just, it's really exciting. I was actually saying to Catherine the other day, as an early modernist, I didn't sort of get into 17th century English political thought because I thought there would be a lot of groundbreaking discoveries. But it's stuff like this that, really makes one feel oneself to be on the cutting edge. I think that it's a significant discovery in a lot of ways and is really going to change the direction of Astle studies. One reason is what Catherine just mentioned, the volume of the marginalia. This sort of interrogative and critical approach that Astle took to texts is in keeping with her own published writings, in which, especially her polemical writings, in which she is constantly quoting and critiquing works by other people, particularly her Whig political opponents. And actually, very often, as someone who wants to introduce Astle's work to undergraduates, it can be quite difficult because it's difficult to know when she's sort of parroting someone else's position or when she's speaking in her own voice. But there's also the key to just her wonderful writing style, which is just dripping with irony. So she's a premier ironist, but she's also just terribly funny. So I'm interested to know if any of the jokes made it into the margins or if she saved those for the text. So that's one thing. It's stylistic and about the cast of her mind. The second thing is just also, I mentioned earlier, this need to break past the kind of the view of being only interested in women thinkers insofar as they are discussing women's issues. And so again, when we teach Astle, we tend to teach her as a feminist, and more particularly as a feminist critique of Whig social contract theory, primarily as espoused by John Locke. And I think the collection is a great corrective to that as well, not only for what's there, but also for what's not there. So there aren't any works by Locke there. There are instead quite a collection of Tory polemics from some of the key writers and theologians of the 17th century, Simon Patrick, Thorndike, Dodwell, and indeed Sam Croft himself. And so I think it's interesting to think about why Astle owns those books, when clearly she has access, as Catherine and James were pointing out, she has access to many more books than the ones that she physically owns. from the perspective of her relationship with other women writers, it's notable that she has 2 works by Damaris Masham, who is another woman philosopher and close companion of John Locke's, and who was quite critical of Astle's co-authored work with John Norris, Letters Concerning the Love of God. So Astell herself is certainly engaging with other women philosophers at the time. So again, I think it's important, you know, many historians of political thought or historians of philosophy who want to do better in sort of integrating women thinkers into how we teach students will do so by sort of presenting them as in conversation with some great man. But what's wonderful in this collection is, again, just the you know, seeing, well, women were in conversation with each other, and Locke might have been a great man, but actually in terms of Astle's interests, you know, she has a book on Machiavelli's political thought, like a critical book, you know, and so there, I think, again, it's just be helpful sort of decentering. I mean, just historically, we might think of the rise of academic women's studies in the 70s and 80s, particularly in the history of political thought, of wanting to revive Astle as a critic of liberalism, for whom Locke was the kind of, you know, figurehead. And so she was serving a polemical purpose for the academics writing about her who wanted to critique liberalism. And now, again, it's just sort of helping us to put Astle back into her own time and sort of letting her speak for herself instead of wanting her to voice the critiques that we want to make of Locke. Oh, and one more thing, Catherine can speak to this, but the other thing just worth noting is, yes, she has books related to her particular projects. We can identify sort of what she's reading in relation to what she's publishing, but there's also evidence of preparation for work that she never did publish, which would have been an introductory text for women to learn science or natural history and philosophy. And so there we see her collecting books on natural history and presumably wanting to synthesize them for other women, although she never had a chance to put that into print. But again, we have the sense of Astle in later life becoming focused on not just advocating for the founding of a women's school, but teaching women herself.
Thank you. So we've talked a lot about kind of, you know, how we might learn a bit about Mary Astell from this. I wondered if James might just briefly say something about the idea of projects to find the provenance of libraries, of collections, what we might learn about college libraries, what we might learn perhaps about private collectors from this kind of project which has gone on here in Magdalene.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's been so beautifully illustrated already by what Catherine and Teresa have said. I mean, one of the great joys of this is to actually, you know, recreate an intellectual profile of an individual, as we've been saying, to actually recreate through this provenance research of bringing together before unknown this unknown library, a sense of the working collection. And as Teresa was saying, you know, by looking at the annotations, one might, you know, in certain circumstances also not only be able to recover a particular library within a library, but perhaps even get some sense of the shelving arrangements or how those books related to each other. The date, obviously the date of the acquisition, the date of annotation sometimes. So you do get a sense of a sort of working collection. And I think that's one of the great and important things. Another aspect of this is also, you know, sometimes there's a tendency to think of the life of an individual as being restricted as having a direct relationship to the time of which books were published, and to forget about the acquisition of much older books. And we talked a little bit then about how Mary Astell might have acquired books, but actually looking also at the provenance aspect, you get a sense of where these books were coming from, how they came into the collection, and how many of those books were antiquarian and sometimes very difficult to get hold of at the time. So one of the joys of this reclamation project within a library is to get a sense of the timeline of this sort of collection. So the collection as a working collection, but also one in which the books which are being brought together within that particular collection come across from over many generations and have that chronological relationship to each other. And I think, you know, sometimes you come across, just going away a little bit from from Astle for the moment. As you said, Jane, I mean, the old library has been such a treasure for a long time to those of us who knew about it. And within the old library at Magdalene, as I know Catherine will be finding from this continuing project, to actually show exactly what's there. There are so many little libraries within libraries, collections that have come together at different times. It's really wonderful. I mean, one aspect of one of those, just to give another quick example, is that the Queen Christina of Sweden, when she abdicated the crown of Sweden in 1650 and went into exile in the Vatican, she took part of her library with her, and that library today is in the Vatican Library. But many of the other books were left behind in Stockholm, and those books in turn had been raided by her father in the 30 Years' War and had come from a whole host of different monasteries and other sort of collections over North Germany. And in about 20 years later, in 1670, part of that library was then sold. Queen Christina had died, the library was sold from Stockholm, and it came in a ship across the North Sea to King's Lynn, and then came down the river, came down the Cam, and arrived at the marketplace, same place that we have today in Cambridge, the same marketplace, and fellows from 3 different colleges rushed to the stall. I think I'm right in saying it was Emma Christ, and it was certainly Magdalene. And on the shelves in the old library there are some of the books from Queen Christina's library, and in turn, because before, they come from other libraries, other collections, pre-Reformation German monasteries. So you've got a sense of this extraordinary breakage over many centuries of different libraries, of books from different libraries, all now arranged in a helter-skelter in a different way. And so what Catherine's doing, and others are doing too, is to sort of unpick through provenance to try and have try to actually put together again the libraries. And now in this wonderful sort of global digital age that we have, there's the possibility of now reimagining older collections, which are currently perhaps scattered across libraries such as the old library in Magdalene, but also all sorts of other libraries in Europe and indeed across the world.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very inspirational way of thinking about it. So thank you. Well, I think I'll move on to ask colleagues to think a little bit about some of the questions which are coming in, because there are some very interesting questions. Maybe Catherine might like to tackle one from Robert Chartner. Hi, Robert. How do we know kind of how this collection ended up in Magdalene? How did we acquire these books? What's the speculation about that?
Not for certain, but there's no hard documentary evidence in the archives, but I feel there must be a connection with Daniel Waterland. We know that he was a fan of Astle's work. He cites Astle's work in his own famous publication, in his Advice for a Young Student. He was a bibliophile. He helped with the receipt of Pepys Library, and in the published college history, it says that once the Pepys Library came to the college, the fellows were thinking, oh, we better beef up, you know, our working library, because the Pepys Library is slightly putting the other library to shame. So there was a real sort of effort to collect books at that time. So that really ties in nicely, because Pepys Library came 1724, Astle passes away 1731. So, and evidently the books come to Magdalene. And there was a biographical sketch of Astle by George Ballard that was done a few years after Astle's death. And in the original draft of that bibliographical sketch, Ballard says that she gave her library, which was a pretty large one, to Magdalene College in Oxford. But then the in Oxford bit is crossed out. So I think, well, I'm guessing here, but because Ballard was in fact a fellow of Magdalene College at Oxford, he may have checked there and then subsequently found out, it's Magdalene College, Cambridge. That's my thinking. But it also shows that there was obviously a conscious decision by Astle to leave the books to Magdalene College for whatever reason. Not sure. It may just be that because her uncle went to Cambridge and Magdalene was on the radar because of the Pepys Library coming there. It may simply be that, but those are a few thoughts anyway.
Lovely, thank you. Thanks, Catherine. Teresa, I wonder if I could ask you perhaps to engage a little bit with this, kind of like the title of our talk, the idea of her being the first feminist. And perhaps if it's not asking you to put too much into the bag, we've got a couple of questions. One is about ideas of dissent and her relationship with publications about orthodoxy and dissent. And the other is about her being a scientist. And I don't know whether, I don't know if that's too much to sort of collaborate and put all into a single bag, but I wondered whether you could somehow summarize that sense of her being, doing all these things which one might associate, perhaps not with women so much in the period, and yet being the first feminist.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that it's really interesting, right? We do want to be able to know what labels to apply to her so that we can fit her in to the traditions as we think of them, and especially as how we teach them. As an intellectual historian, as a Cambridge trained intellectual historian, I am of course allergic to anachronism. However, I do think that the label feminist applies to her, and I think it's fair to describe her as the first English feminist. I mean, I think we've got to be careful when we say first. I mean, we can't forget Jane Eyre and her defense of women in 1589. So there were certainly defenses of the female sex written in English before. And certainly there were defenses of the female sex written in French, Italian, and German before. But what's distinctive about what Astle's doing, I think, is that she is arguing systematically across a number of works for the equality of the sexes. Now, today we think of that as kind of obviously, well, a feminist, of course, a feminist is in favor of the equality of the sexes. But actually, if you look at the tradition of feminist or proto-feminist writings, they're very often what we might call a Platonic feminist text, in that what they're arguing is that the best of women are equal to, if not superior to, the best of men. So they end up taking the form very often of catalogues of great ladies, where we list Hypatia and the Amazons, etc., to sort of show that the heights of female virtue put to shame the claims of all these small-minded men. And so what I think is interesting, and certainly how Astle fits into my own work and my own project, I'm interested in her as someone who's engaging in the late 17th century in this debate about what it means to describe human beings as equal. And for Astle, it means that there is no difference between men and women on the whole. And that, again, today might sound obvious to us, but is actually a really distinctive and original position. And there she is drawing on Cartesian texts, but predominantly ones written by men and not by women. So I would defend the label. On the question of Astle as her views on dissent, and particularly her status as a kind of conservative, anti-toleration, anti-occasional conformity writer, for the great question in the Q&A. So we don't see her owning texts by Whig defenders of occasional conformity. We do see her owning, interestingly, one book by Gilbert Burnet, the sort of famous latitudinarian bishop. And interestingly, Burnet was actually one of the famous opponents of Astell's proposal for a women's academy. He thought it smacked of popery. It sounded a bit too Catholic for his tastes. So it's interesting to see that she owns something by Burnet. And similarly, owning two works by Masham. Again, Masham would be associated with the kind of Whig latitudinarian faction in church politics, but that's sort of all we get. And in terms of Astle as a scientist, again, anachronism, can we really talk about science in the 17th century? I think that what's interesting is we can talk about science, can we talk about scientists in the 17th century? I think, again, it's interesting there is a kind of a promissory note that was never delivered on, this idea that what she wanted to write a kind of accessible introduction to scientific ideas for women, in much the way she had written about philosophical theology or kind of Platonist ideas in her correspondence with John Norris, as sort of putting into practice the idea that women can access these ideas too. And indeed, the sequel to A Serious Proposal to the Ladies, which she publishes in 1696, is precisely meant to offer this kind of roadmap, or sort of a path through philosophic knowledge for women. Again, to say, don't be intimidated, don't be discouraged. You know, women's minds are the same as men's minds, and here's a text for you.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for embracing, you know, that sort of wonderful, you know, bag of different questions. And thank you also for the questioners who asked those. Very, you know, very interesting kind of way of both thinking about her as a feminist writer, but also thinking that part of her being a feminist writer is that she's a scientist and that she's interested in politics, and she's not just writing about women's issues, she's right there. You know, James, yes?
Yeah, I just want to add to because a really important, interesting point that Teresa just made is almost like sort of knowing your enemy, or at least know your adversary. Yeah. The importance of actually having in your collect, you know, your rivals, and being able to study that. I think that's going to be something that's really going to be so fascinating coming out of study of these books, which have been rediscovered, for us to see exactly through her annotations, also through the book, you know, the books that are held themselves, the extent to which she was studying those that did not agree with her, or with whom she was all agreeing and were already in print. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it goes back to this question of we know that she had access to books that are not in the collection. So the wonderful question of, so how does she come to own these books? And I think of it a little bit like her friends getting her books by her favorite authors that she knows they know she'll like. Whereas maybe if someone had offered her a book by John Locke, maybe they thought that would have rubbed her the wrong way. Who knows?
James, there's a question which I think might have your name on it. Were the booksellers around St. Paul's able or allowed to trade on Sundays?
Oh, what a really interesting question.
Thank you for the question. It's a very good one.
It's a nice question. Sundays, no. I mean, but it raises another very interesting question. The easy answer is sort of no. You know, you're not trading is not going to go ahead on a Sunday, except where there are certain privileges allowed for Sunday markets and the like. And similarly, working, we've got to make a very clear distinction between what's happening in these printing houses or bookshops, and that the printing work, we heard that Catherine was saying about Wilkins being a publisher as well. And publisher is a very modern, well, publisher often means the financing of the book, and we tend to use the original term of bookseller to mean the person who was selling and perhaps also printing the book, but might not necessarily have had a printing press in the house at all. So as far as printing was concerned, no, not on a Sunday, and indeed Mondays were sometimes off limits too. There's quite an interesting discussion about the Saint Monday phenomenon of not working on a Monday. But these were, in terms of the printing places, these were very, very hard working sites in which there was a number of fires, in fact, because of the candles that were burnt and set the printing printing houses on fire. So they are very, what we would think of as very labor intensive printing establishments. But in terms of thinking of it as a bookshop, the interesting question it brings up, I suppose, is not just the day, but also what we would now in modern terms call opening hours. And I think that it would be a mistake to think of it as sort of opening hours. I think in a way one would have a sense of someone actually coming and knocking on a door, going back to that idea of these sites of being really interesting for people to perhaps have an appointment to go and visit, but also to be able to go into the shop meet with people, meet the bookseller and those working there at sort of almost, I don't really want to say random hours, but in a more sort of, almost in a more sort of informal way than we would expect now. So to get away from the notion of opening hours or of bookshops on particular days. But the quick answer on a Sunday is no.
Catherine, there are a couple of interesting questions which relate to the sort of the way in which she marked her books. And if you could say something a little bit about if there's anything we can learn from her handwriting, either about the dating of when she did different annotations or whatever, and also maybe something about her reading practice. Did she annotate all the way through a book, or only at the beginning, or how did that work? Can you just say a little bit more about Mary Astell's sort of reading and annotating practice?
Writing is fairly consistent, I've seen over the examples. However, with the gifts, sometimes she uses a more florid hand. Maybe she's taking her time on it a bit more to express that this was a gift from a friend, especially if it was a bequest from a friend who passed away. But the handwriting is quite consistent. On quite a lot of the books, she actually puts the date of when she bought them, which is very handy indeed. So you can, so you can establish a timeline in that sense. There's various different ways she marked the book, and as I mentioned, she used pen and pencil, and she used the end papers to make notes. In one of the books, she writes a very detailed index of the book, and I think this was done quite early on, maybe youthful enthusiasm. That was a very detailed one. But also in the French books, she sometimes translates the passages that are most interesting to her out into English. So I think that really tells you she's highlighting the bits she really wants to remember. But yes, as you mentioned, Jane, sometimes there's annotations at the very beginning of the book, and then obviously the book hasn't been read because it's blank. But most of the books you can see that have been pretty thoroughly engaged with. And if you may have seen the article on the university website about the findings. They highlight a book by Descartes, which is one of the most heavily annotated books, and she's making lots of notes and observations in that one. So if you want to see more pictures of that,
very good. Thank you. Thank you.
Could I ask? Sorry, could I just ask Catherine? Are there any, just a question that occurred, are there any annotations by others in the Mary Astell books? That are perhaps something that was already written in when she was given it, or something later.
There was one that comes to mind which has a very, very small initialing on, which I think is IA, and I thought, well, maybe that's Isaac Astle, one of her uncles. But apart from that, no, not really. I haven't seen annotations by other people, so that's quite interesting, because I'm sure she would have been buying these books secondhand, already bound. So yeah, maybe quite unusual, but she's bought some clean copies there.
Well, thank you. I think we're sort of getting to the end of time, which sounds a little bit apocalyptic, but I don't think we can. I'm just looking at the questions. I hope that the questions have already been to some extent answered, and if not, we would be delighted, I'm sure, to hear from people through the website of the library if there's anything else that those here would like to hear about. I'll just mention a little bit about the kind of future of the old library, that we're doing a number of projects. The Provenance Project has produced this absolutely brilliant and wonderful kind of result, which has obviously inspired scholars across a whole range of different areas. And indeed, somebody wrote to me and said, what else is there in there? Kind of, as if we were going to sort of start opening cupboards and producing kind of large golden objects in a kind of Harrison Ford sort of way. But I do think that these projects, which in some ways are professional projects to do with cataloguing and making available to the outside world what we've got, can sometimes produce these wonderful results, and it's a great thing that that college libraries can put in the resources and the time and the thought to do this kind of work. So I just wanted to congratulate Catherine really on her observational skills in having sort of picked this out, which nobody I think had ever seen before, as far as I'm aware, in the library. It's just a fantastic thing, and it's really contributed so much to scholarship, to thinking about women's studies, thinking about philosophy, sort of 17th, 18th century philosophy, regardless of gender studies. I think it's really important from that point of view, thinking about science, thinking about the history of the book and book collecting, and particularly, making us understand more about our own library, which has been there, under our nose all of this time. So, well done to Catherine, and thank you for joining us. And also thanks to Teresa for your fantastic contribution. Just really put the whole thing into context. I'm sure others like myself learned a lot about Mary Astell from what you were saying. And thank you to James as well for that even broader context, about how people were walking around the streets of London buying their books, and how we might think about the provenance of books, how we can use this kind of scholarship to enhance our understanding of the history of the book. So thank you all very much indeed, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. Just fantastic questions, and I hope it's been enjoyable. So I think that's kind of wrapping it up. So, and thank you also to Sarah and Emma for, they're the sort of technical people